3. Mallows Bay Fleet. Mallows Bay is home to what some have described as the largest shipwreck fleet in the Western Hemisphere. It's located just 40 miles south of Washington, D.C., on the Maryland side of the Potomac River across from Virginia. Most of the 200 or so wrecks that litter the bay's relatively shallow waters date back to World War I, when the U.S. underwent a rapid shipbuilding program under the Woodrow Wilson administration to prepare for the country's entry into the conflict. The program began in 1917 as an effort to replace the 200 Allied merchant vessels that were being destroyed every month by German U-boats. To keep up with this urgent demand and ramp up ship production, the U.S. Shipping Board created the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which focused specifically on building ships. But the hastily built vessels were plagued by construction problems and mechanical failures, and by the time the war ended, only 98 of the 734 vessels that had been ordered were delivered, and only 76 of those ships were capable of carrying cargo. After investing $300 million in the project, the U.S. government sold the inactive and incomplete ships for scrap for just $750,000. The Alexandria, Virginia-based Western Marine and Salvage Company purchased most of the ships and relocated them to the Potomac River. They were scrapped for metal, but disposing of the wooden hulls was difficult. The hulls were eventually moved to their current location in Mallows Bay, with plans to burn and beach them. In what remains the greatest destruction of ships at one time in American history, 31 of the hulls were burned on November 7, 1925. During the Great Depression, scrap prices plummeted, and in 1931, the company abandoned the project. By then, around 169 hulls had been moved into Mallows Bay. In addition to containing World War I-era wrecks, the bay is home to the remains of ships spanning 3 centuries, including wrecks dating back to the Civil War. The area also contains Native American archaeological sites dating back 12,000 years. In 1942, the government-organized Metals Reserve Company contracted with the Bethlehem Steel Corporation to salvage whatever remaining scrap metal they could find in the fleet for use in the Allied World War II effort. The Ghost Fleet was largely forgotten after the war until the 1960s, when a straw company for the local electric utility provider campaigned for the removal of the hulls, with the hopes of building a nearby power generating station. But the federal government recognized that an ecosystem had developed among the fleet and ruled in a landmark decision that its destruction was unnecessary. Since then, the derelict ships have continued to serve as an important habitat for plants and animals, and an attraction for kayakers, scientists, and outdoor enthusiasts. These partially submerged vessels are home to vegetation, fish, beavers, and other mammals, birds, including bald eagles and osprey, amphibians, and even bats, who use the rotting hulls as a breeding location. In 2019, in the first decision of its kind in nearly 2 decades, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration designated the 18-square-mile area a national marine sanctuary. It came on the heels of an effort that began in 2014 among public officials and conservationists who saw the site's environmental importance, as well as its tourism and educational value, and its potential to create jobs. The campaign was met with pushback from business owners who make their living along the Potomac River, and feared that the move would introduce stricter regulations that would negatively impact their operations. 5 years after hitting a discouraging standstill, the proposal was finally approved. Why do you think it took so long for something to be done to the ships of Mallows Bay? Tell us in the comments, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. SS Valencia. Built in 1882, the iron-hulled passenger steamer SS Valencia originally operated between Venezuela and New York City. After being attacked by a Spanish cruiser in Guantanamo Bay in 1897, the 252-foot-long vessel began transporting passengers along the American West Coast between San Francisco and Alaska. She also served as a troop ship to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. After the conflict, the Valencia resumed its route along the West Coast, but she wasn't very well liked among passengers. sailors who thought the second-class rated vessel was too small and felt overly exposed to the elements. She also navigated poorly during the winter and was also notoriously slow, with an average speed of just 11 knots, or 12.7 miles per hour. In addition to being inefficient and uncomfortable, the Valencia had a poor safety record starting in 1901, when her owners were fined $9,000 for carrying more passengers than their permit allowed. In 1902, the Valencia collided with another ship off Seattle and punctured her hull. An investigation found that if the vessel had been damaged below the waterline, she would have capsized and sank. 3 years later, in 1905, the Valencia ran aground at St. Michael, Alaska, with 62 crew members, 3 passengers, and 500 tons of cargo on board. Luckily, nobody was injured and the ship was able to resume its voyage with the help of a tugboat after unloading some of its cargo. At that point, the Valencia became a backup boat that was used only when needed and spent the rest of her time docked in San Francisco. She set out for what would end up being her final voyage on January 20th, 1906, with 56 crew members, 9 officers, and at least 108 passengers aboard, serving in place of another ship that was undergoing repairs at the time. Early the next morning, she encountered bad weather, forcing the crew to rely on dead reckoning instead of navigating based on the positions of celestial bodies. Consequently, the ship struck a reef in Canadian waters 11 miles off Vancouver Island, tearing a huge gash in the hull right before a large wave lifted her off the reef. All but one of the Valencia's 7 lifeboats were lowered into the water amid the confusion and panic, despite the captain's orders to the contrary. They were improperly manned, resulting in 3 flipping and spilling their occupants while being lowered, 2 that capsized, and 1 that vanished. In the meantime, massive waves continued to batter the ship, and it began to break apart. One of the few survivors, Chief Freight Clerk Frank Len, later recalled seeing terrified passengers being swept off the deck and into the water by the seemingly endless waves. Nearby ships did what they could to help, but they were essentially powerless as they watched the Valencia slip beneath the waves while passengers clung desperately to the rigging for dear life. Of the 12 men who reached the shore, 3 were washed back out and died. The 9 survivors followed a telegraph line to a lineman's cabin, where they were able to summon help. Meanwhile, the lifeboat that vanished reached land with a small group of survivors on board, and they hiked to a lifehouse, arriving in a clearly crazed and traumatized state. Altogether, only 37 people survived the sinking, all of whom were men. The exact death toll is unclear, but the number is definitely more than 100 and is thought to be at least 117. Authorities left the wreck in place, and what's left of it can still be seen to this day. An investigation blamed the wreck on poor weather and navigational errors, and the failure to save lives on a poor infrastructure and response plan along the Vancouver Island coast. Within months of the sinking, the Valencia became the topic of local rumors and ghost stories, and reported sightings of a phantom ship continued for years to come. 6 months after the disaster, the wife of a New Cha Nulth fisherman reported seeing a lifeboat containing 8 skeletons in a sea cave. It was deemed too dangerous to try recovering the bodies. Several other people made similar claims in the months following the sinking. One of the most chilling stories about the Valencia came from a handful of survivors who claimed to see a phantom ship trailing in the exhaust behind them while they were being transported to Seattle on a ship called the City of Topeka. As they watched the ghost vessel sail straight toward the rocks, just like the Valencia had, they even claimed that the ghost ship signaled to the City of Topeka. But there were no more incidents along their journey after that. The next alleged sighting came in 1910, when the Seattle Times reported that some sailors had witnessed a ship that looked like the Valencia near Pachina Point, in the same area where the Valencia sank. Like many similar reports that would come over the following years, they claimed to see waves crashing into the vessel while people clung to the rigging. The wreckage is open to visitors today, and stories of the phantom ship and sightings of skeleton-filled lifeboats continue more than a century later. 1. HMS Eurydice. Built in Portsmouth, England during the 1840s, The 141-foot-long HMS Eurydice was a 26-gun Royal Navy corvette that was designed to operate in shallow waters at very fast speeds. In 1877, it was converted into a seagoing ship for naval training exercises. Later that year, the ship departed for a 3-month tour through the West Indies under the command of Captain Marcus Hare. In early March 1878, following a long voyage back across the Atlantic, the Eurydice got caught in a freak snowstorm off the Isle of Wight. Onlookers recalled seeing the ship disappear from sight with its gun ports open as it capsized and sank in Sandown Bay. After realizing that nearly all hope was lost for preventing the ship from sinking, Captain Hare gave the order for every man to save himself. But he knew that most of the crew was trapped inside the ship and would never reach safety, which meant that his fate was sealed. Then, in keeping with maritime tradition and his strong Christian values, he prayed as he went down with the Eurydice. 5 men were pulled from the water after the storm, but only 2 survived. The rest of the ship's 319 crew members and trainees drowned or died from exposure during their perilous battle for survival. It was one of the most devastating peacetime naval disasters in British history. Future Prime Minister Winston Churchill witnessed the catastrophe. He was just 3 years old at the time, when his family was living along the southeast coast of the Isle of Wight in Ventnor. The wreck was refloated later that year, but it was too badly damaged to be of any use and was broken up. Its bell remains at St. Paul's Church in the Isle of Wight, which is also home to several memorials and cemeteries, including one that houses the ship's anchor. 7 crew members are buried in one cemetery, and another contains the burials of 4 crew members' bodies that washed up on shore, including 2 who were never identified. In the aftermath of the disaster, some pointed out that the Eurydice was known to be unstable due to its extreme design. Others pointed the finger at Captain Hare, who decided to sail into the storm even though 2 other ships in the area saw the dangers and appropriately avoided it. But officials ruled that the sinking was caused by the extreme weather and for no other reason, and the captain and crew were absolved of any wrongdoing. Ever since the disaster, there have been numerous reported sightings of the Eurydice sailing in the area near where it sank. According to legend, the ghost ship vanishes into the mist of the English Channel before anyone can approach it. For the most part, these sightings have been written off as superstition or people's eyes playing tricks on them. But 2 incidents were so seemingly credible that even skeptics had a hard time dismissing them. One of them happened in the 1930s, when Royal Navy submarine commander F. Lipscomb saw the Eurydice appear in front of his vessel. He rushed to avoid hitting the ship, only for it to disappear right before his eyes. While filming the Crown and Country docuseries in 1998, Prince Edward and the film crew claimed to witness a 3-masted ghost ship off the Isle of Wight. They also claimed that they captured footage of it, but the video has never surfaced. In addition to being at the center of ghost ship legends, the Eurydice is eerily linked to another maritime tragedy. After it sank, the vessel was replaced by a similar 26-gun frigate called the HMS Juno, which was renamed the HMS Atalanta by the time it set sail for Bermuda in 1878, with 280 officers and crew members aboard. Just 2 days after arriving in Bermuda in 1880, the Atalanta left for England and was never seen or heard from again. Nobody knows when or where it sank, but it's likely that the ship crossed paths with a brutal storm that blew across the Atlantic around the same time it set sail. A former crew member revealed that the vessel was overweight and claimed that he had personally witnessed it rolling to extremes during bad weather in the past. In addition to having a history of handling poorly in storms, the Atalanta's crew was young and inexperienced, making the possibility that it sank seem even more plausible. Crew members from a gunboat that passed through the area around the time of the storm reported seeing large amounts of debris in the water. And while it's probably a safe bet to assume we know what happened, the Atalanta's fate remains a mystery to this day. Thanks for watching. Have you ever seen a ghost ship? Tell us about it in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.